I am going to, as they say, hit two birds with one stone in this video. I'm going to talk about the spindle roughing gouge, and I'm also going to make a couple of fire starters. I chose to use lace wood and cocobolo wood. And if you're interested in these kits, I got them from PSI, Penn State Industries in the USA. And if you don't want to buy kits, you can purchase the pieces separately online. And a brief disclaimer, please use or wear all proper safety equipment. Now, I won't get into sharpening in this video. I'll leave that for a different video or series. But in general, spindle roughing gouges come in different sizes, lengths, steel thicknesses, different steels, and can have varying profiles, bevels, tip shapes, and say no burr, a burr, honed, not honed. It just depends on what you like to turn and what you prefer to use. However, the spindle roughing gouge does have two consistencies that I can think of. One being, you should never use a spindle roughing gouge on, say, cross grain, as in a bowl blank. You only use a spindle roughing gouge on spindle work or grain that is parallel with the bed of your lathe. This has to deal with safety concerns or possible injury. The tangs on these tools are generally thin and can break very easily if you were to get a catch. Also, the basic geometry of the spindle roughing gouge comes into play here. As in the bevel angle, generally around 45 degrees, but that's a personal preference. And the flute shape and or tool size, all of these can add up to trouble on cross-grain applications. For example, if you used a bowl blank in this orientation, and you were to use the spindle roughing gouge, it would cut on one side and then skip on the next side, then cut on the next side, then skip on the next side, or dig right into the end grain and you'll have a very bad day. And another safety concern is the corners. You can see, even though they have different profiles on the front, they do have sharp corners, and those can potentially get caught and you can have bad catches. Another question that I often hear about is, how can you tell what is a spindle roughing gouge versus a regular spindle gouge? In general, the appearance will let you know. The spindle roughing gouge has a more pronounced flute, and it also generally has thicker steel on the side as opposed to, say, a regular spindle gouge, which most of the time has a shallower flute. Hopefully you can tell from this photo, the tools on the left are the spindle roughing gouges, and they are much different in shape than, say, these round bowl gouges or the regular spindle gouges or the detail spindle gouges. The spindle roughing gouge is probably mostly confused with the regular spindle gouge, especially in starter sets, which is where these tools came from. The top is the spindle roughing gouge and the bottom is just the traditional spindle gouge. Also, you'd be less likely to confuse these two if you didn't buy a set and you bought them individually. There is a good practice method called the ABCs, or the ankle bevel cut, to help you use a traditional wood turning bevel cutting tool. I'm not sure who came up with this practice, but it is a good method to use, and it helps you to remember when you're first starting out in wood turning. So you start by anchoring your tool to the tool rest. Always keep the tool shaft anchored to the tool rest at all times, or bad things can happen. So as you bring up your roughing gouge tool handle, your tool's cutting edge will come down, and you will start to ride the bevel heel, and it will bounce around a bit. This is okay because the wood is usually square, uneven at this point, and not round. Wow, that's a terrible arrow. Sorry. So as the tip comes down and the heel is bouncing around and you're bringing the tool farther down and the handle up, eventually the tip will start cutting the wood and the bevel will be riding the wood. And this is the ABCs: the anchor, the bevel, and the cut. There are several different types of basic cuts you can make with a spindle roughing gouge, and I reiterate, not on cross grain wood. This is because the cutting edge and the angle and the tang, these tools will dig into the end grain, and not just on bowl blanks, but any project with cross-grain orientation. For example, a bottle stopper mounted in a cross-grain fashion. The cuts should be right on center line or just a hair above it. And my first cut is usually not in the middle of the workpiece. I don't just jam it in the center because this can cause large pieces or splinters to come off. I usually start, I don't know, say an inch from the end, and I'll use consecutive cuts overlapping each other. I'll do this on both sides. If you start from say here right to left and going into the end grain, the cutting edge when it first hits the wood is not supported and big chunks can fly off and you can lose control of your tool. I would also like to note that you can use the spindle roughing gouge this way from right to left into the end grain, but you really should be more experienced and have a really good feel for the tool before you start using it that way. Then once both ends are somewhat round, I'll do long transverse cuts to kind of smooth out the middle. And you can use your tool on top of the wood piece to see if it's round or not. You don't have to turn off your lathe. And then once it is somewhat round, I'll use a planing cut from one side to the next. And I'll go really slow to get a nice fine finish. And if your grain on your wood is kind of funky, it might be best to use the skew for that, but that'll be another video. You'll also notice here as I'm doing the consecutive cuts that I'll be turning the flute towards the cut, and this is because it will help with chip deflection, and it will also make the edge more of a slicing cut. And once again, this is a preference. You can turn the flute straight up and use the spindle roughing gouge that way. And as the piece becomes round and smaller, you'll want to keep moving your tool rest in closer, as close as you can based on your tool and the bevel angle and what's comfortable for you. This goes for basically any tool that you're going to use, not just a spindle roughing gouge. Make sure the tool rest is as close to the piece as possible. And you'll also want to increase your speed as the piece gets smaller, and based on the diameter of the piece would determine the mid and max range of your speeds. And the lathe speed and or how fast you're cutting can influence whether it is a smooth finish or a rough surface. For example, a low lathe speed with a transversing tool cut equals ripple cuts and a lot of surface damage. And who likes that someone hanging over your shoulder, nagging you to remember to do this and that, and don't forget your face shield? I know. Well, when it comes to safety, I deserve to be nagged. And I also know of some turners that will only use a skew to rough out their spindle blanks, and they don't even own spindle roughing gouges. And that's fine too. I use a skew also to rough out spindle blanks, but I also do love using the spindle roughing gouge. It really does make quick work of turning square spindle blanks round. And I like using the spindle roughing gouges on spatulas and three-sided spindle work that has on and off air turning, where there's air and then there's wood, air and then there's wood. Another important thing to remember is how you hold the spindle roughing gouge and how you're standing or sitting at the lathe. For spindle turning, when I'm doing a planing cut, I'll use an underhand, and my index finger will be up against the tool rest and my thumb will be anchored on the other side of the gouge. Opposed to overhand, which I'll use for the roughing and the transverse cuts, with my thumb above the tool. And my feet will usually be facing the lathe and relaxed, and my feet are usually parallel, and I'm not too close to my lathe. And this will make it so I can move from side to side for these longer planing and transverse cuts. The handle of the tool is usually up against my side, and again my arms are comfortable and relaxed. and my elbows are not sticking out, and I'm also not too far from the lathe either, so I'm hunched over and causing fatigue for turning for several hours. The backhand stabilized. This is the tool for control, and the leaning hand is pushing the tool and anchoring the tool to the tool rest. Sometimes I'll intentionally lean more towards the left with my feet out towards the right and start the cut on the left side and then go all the way from the left all the way to the right in one cut so I don't have to move my feet during the cut. Although there are those times when I feel like breaking out in a swing or some sort of salsa. Just kidding. Well, I hope you enjoyed this little tutorial on the spindle roughing gouge, and I hope I touched on a majority of the basics. And I will have more videos in this series to come, as well as some sharpening videos. And please do remember not to use a spindle roughing gouge on cross-grain projects. Well, I'm going to let these cure for about 24 hours. Both woods came out great. The finishes came out great. Same finish on both. They look pretty much the same sheen. I'd like to thank all of my subscribers, especially the people that have continued to make purchases on Amazon. It really helps me out to keep making these videos. I really appreciate it. Please stay safe in your shop at all times. And until next time, take care and thank you. Thank you for watching.